I found myself on the way to Ngundu Halt, a road junction south of Mashvingo in southern Zimbabwe. My neighbor and friend, Manashi Magweba, had finally paid off the lobola for his intended, and now he and Lydia were attending the first of their 3 wedding ceremonies. Ngundu was where Manashi's parents lived, and it was to be a full-blown traditional African wedding. Lydia worked as an accountant for one of the big banks in Harare and had grown up in the suburbs. Most of her bridesmaids gathered in her family compound after work on the Friday night. I found myself sharing the floor with Kate, who was to be one of the bridesmaids, and several young professional women from the bank. After repeated denials of my relationship with the only European in the woman, plus the consumption of a number of bottles of clear beer, I had managed to see several of the bridesmaids in action. Lizzie stood out, not the least because she stood over 6 feet tall, and I had hazy visions of her carrying a spear and going to war. The majority of the bridesmaids were barely 5 foot tall, tending towards rotundity, but with energy to burn. They were still dancing as I faded into a corner despite the noise and loud thumping music issuing from a large stereo that caused my head to throb. The next day, Hove, one of the technical subject teachers from the school, Kate and myself took the bus to Mashvingo, transferred and safely reached our destination at Ngundu shortly before sunset. We spent the night with Martin, a colleague who was teaching at the local secondary school, and in the morning we continued to the Magweba compound. Along the way, we encountered a sight that stopped us in our tracks. A herd of oversized African cattle was standing still and ignoring the yelps and cracks of the whips that the small shepherd boys were issuing in an attempt to move the beasts off to their pasture further down the valley. The scene lasted several minutes, and then, suddenly, they all turned and moved along the road, trailing small boys behind them. "That's where the old bull was slaughtered," Martin explained. "He was huge and quite old. The Minister of Education came to open the new classroom block, so the headmaster killed the bull so he could feed all the families who arrived for the opening. Ever since then, morning and night, when the herd passes that spot, they stop for a good 5 minutes. Creeps me out." The Magweba compound was like something out of a Bruegel painting. 3 large former petroleum barrels serving extra-large sadza pots had 2 women either side of them wielding small tree trunks as they rhythmically pounded the glutinous mass into breakfast. Smoke issued from smaller fires where others were cooking up local home brews, something that I had long ago decided resembled reconstituted vomit combined with the delayed kick of a water buffalo. It was definitely something to be wary of. Against the wall, there were smaller pots of boiling oil perched on 3 stones into which were being thrown chicken parts and the intestines of goats. In the center of the scene, a whole cow was slowly roasting on an open spit. As we arrived at the compound, so too did the bridesmaids. Their journey had begun at the same time as ours, but due to a mechanical difficulty on the way, there had been delays. The vehicle came to a halt in front of the main house, the rear door thrown open, and the 6 occupants were ceremoniously enticed outside by envelopes containing money. Once exited, large sheets were thrown over their heads in the pretense that they were now somehow invisible, and they were individually escorted into the house. This was carried out amidst a group of older women who danced, sweeping the ground with small grass brushes as they did so, and emitting ear-splitting ululations. Kate and I did our best to be useful and soon found ourselves moving tables and chairs, courtesy of the school, into some semblance of order that provided a focal point for the ceremonies. Canopies were strung over the thorny trees to provide shelter from the sun, and bodies began to gather in clusters and occupy seats. I began to stake out spots where I could best take pictures of the event as it unfolded. The cost and poor quality of film processing in Zimbabwe at the time had made my relationship with my older brother invaluable. I used to mail the rolls of film off to London, where they were processed, and Brother Stephen got to share my adventures. In exchange, I received affordable, clean, clear prints. Menashe had seen them and seen some of my earlier pictures from London, and instantly decided that I was to be the official wedding photographer, hence my inclusion in the event. I clicked merrily away during the ceremony and did a little dance as I approached the table on which all the bridal presents were being stacked. I had carefully observed how the relatives were dancing their way up there before me, some going on to kiss the bride and groom, showing that they were related. Now it was my turn. People were quiet. "Who is this fellow?" "I am giving Menashe and Lydia rolls of wedding pictures," I announced in my bravest voice as I placed 3 empty containers on the table. This was greeted with enthusiastic clapping and the vocal pyrotechnics that only older African women can produce. Other relatives had given pots, toasters, cows, and the table was groaning under the weight. My dance back to my seat was somehow a little lighter and less self-conscious. When I returned to a seat, I found myself next to a tall woman wearing a crown of chicken feathers, a goatskin skirt, and a black top. Her calves were laced up in leather thongs that held 2 pieces of leather wrapped around her shins. She did not look at me, and I pondered the idea of taking her picture. I heard a husky, male-sounding voice, and it caught me by surprise. I looked around. Who was addressing me? "Gafford," Hove called me. "Menashe's grandfather is asking you why you cook your meat in that funny way." "Sorry, which one is he?" I turned, looking for an old man, but failed to find anyone who looked old enough. "He is late," replied Hove. "Excuse me?" I still hesitated over the expression, but it finally registered. Menashe's grandfather was deceased. "Lizzie is a spirit medium, and Menashe's grandfather wants to know about your spaghetti sauce, I think." I was unsure as to how to respond to a dead person. It wasn't something one did very often. I looked at the transformed Lizzie. I had completely failed to recognize the prim, powerful young bank clerk with whom I had shared the evening only 36 hours earlier. Not only was she dressed somewhat differently, but she also spoke so convincingly like a man in a deep, guttural voice. "It is a way of cooking food from the place where I come from," I replied, "in my home area." "And do you come from far away?" interpreted Hove as Lizzie again spoke in her deeply male voice. The exchange lasted a few fleeting seconds, but it left me deeply unsettled. The next morning I wondered, do things come in threes? And of course the answer was yes. I had seen cows paying homage to their deceased leader. I had spoken to a man who died some 20 years earlier, and now I was being congratulated because an ancestor had saved my life. The previous night had been lively and the drinks had flowed freely, and even I had managed to shed my inhibitions and dance the night through. However, I was always an early riser, and the next morning I chose to climb a magnificent kopje that loomed over the valley and reputedly offered a clear view right down to South Africa. As I neared the top, I was confronted by a steep rock face that I was unable to climb. As I pondered my options, I heard a distinct snuffling sound. It sounded like there was a warthog nearby, and I decided to wait on the edge of the kopje where I had spied a small outcrop and then 100-foot drop-off. It seemed safe. After admiring the view for about 20 minutes, I made my way back to the trail and descended back to the compound. "Where have you been at such an early hour?" Hove asked me while we waited for tea and bread. "Oh, I went up there." I pointed at the kopje. "The view from up there is incredible." "Did you go by yourself?" Hove asked. When I nodded in affirmation, he continued, "Did you hear any animals on your way?" I did. "And did it sound like this?" said Hove, making a familiar snuffling sound. "It did. I thought it might be a warthog." "My friend, that was the leopard who lives up there. He may have smelled your flesh and said, 'This man who cooks his meat in a funny way, perhaps he will taste funny. You are very lucky to be here.'" I thought I was being teased. "It is no joke, my friend. You were protected by an ancestor today. That is for sure." I felt that familiar tingling at the back of my head as my hair again stood on end. "Who's to say?" became my response to encounters with ancestral spirits for the remainder of my stay in Africa. I often thought about the Inquisition in medieval Europe and wondered if that had been what drove the spirits away from the Christian consciousness. It was rather comforting to imagine that our deceased loved ones were just up there looking out for us.